Let him wait, the nurse said flatly, her voice slicing through the low hum of monitors and distant chatter. People like him don't have anyone coming. And just like that, Ethan Cole became invisible in a room full of professionals trained to notice everything. He lay still on a narrow hospital bed in a crowded Chicago ER at 9:42 p.m., the fluorescent lights above casting a cold, indifferent glow across his face. His clothes were clean but simple, his hands steady despite the situation. No wallet, no ID, no emergency contact listed in the system. Just a name typed in by intake and a blank space where everything else should have been. A doctor glanced over his chart for less than 3 seconds before setting it aside. We'll prioritize the insured cases first, he said, already turning away. The decision made without discussion, without curiosity, without even a second look. Ethan didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't even shift in the bed. He simply stared at the ceiling like he had done this before, like he understood exactly how this room worked and what it meant to be overlooked inside it. Across the hall, a young nurse named Lily Brooks paused mid-step, her eyes lingering longer than the others had. Something about Ethan didn't match the story everyone else had already written for him. It wasn't fear in his expression, it wasn't confusion, it was something quieter, something harder to define, patience. Like he was waiting for something inevitable, not hoping for help, just waiting for the moment things would change, and that unsettled her more than anything else in the room. Around them, the ER moved fast, stretchers rolling, voices calling out vitals, monitors beeping in uneven rhythms. But Ethan remained still in the middle of it all, untouched by urgency, passed over again as another patient was wheeled ahead of him. No insurance. One staff member whispered to another. Then he can wait. And the words hung in the air like policy rather than opinion. Lily stepped closer, her gaze dropping to Ethan's right hand. Fingers curled tightly around something small, almost hidden, a piece of folded paper pressed into his palm like it mattered more than anything else in the room. She hesitated, glancing around. No one was watching, no one was paying attention, because no one believed there was anything worth seeing. Slowly, carefully, she reached down and loosened his grip just enough to slide the paper free. Ethan didn't stop her, didn't react. His eyes remained fixed above as if he already knew what she would find. Lily unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, expecting a name, a number, something ordinary, but instead she read 4 words written in precise, controlled handwriting. Call Victor Romano. Her breath caught. The name didn't belong in a hospital. It belonged somewhere else entirely, somewhere people didn't say out loud. She looked back at Ethan, searching for confirmation, but his expression didn't change. It didn't need to. The room around them suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had leaned in just a little. Lily swallowed hard, pulling her phone from her pocket, her thumb hovering over the screen as doubt flickered through her mind. But that same instinct pushed back harder, telling her this mattered, that he mattered. Even if no one else could see it yet, she dialed the number written beneath the name, each ring stretching longer than the last, the noise of the ER fading into the background as everything narrowed to that single call. 1 ring, 2 rings, then the line clicked, and a voice answered, calm, low, controlled. Who is this? Lily opened her mouth, her voice catching slightly. I'm calling from Mercy General Hospital. There's a man here. She didn't finish the sentence before the voice on the other end cut through. Sharper now, precise. What's his name? She glanced down at the chart. Ethan Cole. Silence followed. Not confusion, not hesitation, something heavier. Then the voice returned, colder. Don't move him. Lily froze, her heart skipping as the words settled in. We're coming. The line went dead. And for the first time since Ethan had arrived, the room around him felt like it was waiting too. The line had already gone silent, but the weight of those 3 words did not leave the room. Do not move him. We are coming. Lily Brooks lowered her phone slowly, her pulse louder now than the monitors around her. She looked at Ethan Cole again, searching for any sign that he had heard what just happened, but he remained exactly the same, eyes steady, breathing controlled, as if nothing had changed at all, as if everything had already been set in motion long before he arrived. Across the nurse station, the same doctor who had dismissed him moments earlier flipped through another chart and called out, We are still holding on that unidentified male, correct? A colleague nodded without looking up. No insurance, no contact. He is stable enough to wait. And just like that, the system reaffirmed its decision. Unaware that the timeline had already shifted, Lily stepped back toward the station, her movements slower now, her thoughts racing faster than she could organize them. Victor Romano was not a name people used casually. It was not a name written on scraps of paper and handed to strangers. It was a name that carried consequence, reputation, and something else. She could not quite define but felt immediately. And yet Ethan had written it down like it was nothing more than a routine instruction, like ordering coffee or calling a ride. That contradiction settled deep in her chest. One of the senior nurses glanced at her, noticing the change in her expression. "You look like you saw something," she said lightly, half joking. Lily hesitated for a fraction too long before responding. "Just checking on him," she said, but her voice lacked its usual certainty. The nurse shrugged and turned away, uninterested, because in this room, curiosity was a luxury reserved for patients who mattered. Minutes passed, but they did not feel like minutes anymore. The air inside the emergency department began to shift in a way no one could explain. Conversations softened, movement slowed, not because anything had visibly changed, but because something unseen had entered the space. A pressure that did not belong to machines or medicine. Lily found herself glancing toward the entrance more often than necessary, her instincts pulling her attention there again and again, as if expecting something to happen at any second. A technician wheeled past with equipment and muttered, "Feels like a storm coming." Another nurse laughed it off, but even she checked the doors a moment later. Ethan remained at the center of it all, untouched, unbothered, his presence now anchoring the room in a way that defied logic. Lily stepped closer to him again, lowering her voice even though there was no reason to whisper. "Who are you?" she asked softly, not expecting an answer, and she did not get one. But his eyes shifted slightly, just enough to acknowledge her, just enough to confirm that he was aware of everything unfolding around him. And that small movement said more than words ever could. At the far end of the hallway, the automatic doors slid open and closed as visitors came and went. But then, 10 minutes after the call, they opened again and did not close right away. The outside lights stretched across the polished floor in a long, sharp line, and for a brief moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. A receptionist near the entrance straightened instinctively, her posture changing before her mind caught up. Footsteps followed, measured, deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant, the kind of steps that did not need permission to enter any space. A security guard near the door turned his head, his expression tightening as recognition flickered across his face. But he said nothing, because something told him speaking would be the wrong move. The sound of those footsteps carried through the hallway, steady and controlled, cutting through the usual chaos of the emergency room like a signal that everything else was about to stop mattering. Lily felt it before she saw it, that shift from uncertainty to inevitability, and as the figure moved closer into view, the weight of the name she had just spoken into the phone settled fully into reality, because this was no longer just a call, it was an arrival, and the moment he stepped into that room, every decision made about Ethan Cole was about to be questioned without a single word needing to be raised. The moment he stepped fully into the emergency room, the air changed in a way no machine could measure. Conversations did not stop all at once, but they slowed, voices lowered. Movements hesitated, as if the room itself recognized something the people inside it had not yet processed. Victor Romano did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not demand attention, and yet every set of eyes found him anyway, drawn by something heavier than authority, something that did not need to announce itself. The security guard near the entrance straightened and stepped aside without being asked. A doctor mid-sentence paused and forgot what he was saying. Even the monitors seemed quieter, their steady beeping now background to something far more present. Victor's gaze moved across the room once, precise and controlled, until it landed on Ethan Cole, and in that instant, the entire situation shifted from assumption to consequence. Lily Brooks felt it immediately, her breath catching as she watched him approach, her mind racing to connect the man in front of her with the voice she had just heard on the phone. But there was no doubt left. This was him, and whatever she had just triggered, could not be undone. Victor stopped beside Ethan's bed, his expression unreadable, not anger, not panic, just focus, like a man reviewing something that should never have been allowed to happen. He did not touch Ethan right away. He simply looked at him, taking in the details that everyone else had ignored. Then his eyes lifted slowly toward the staff around him. And that was when the discomfort began to spread. Because it was not loud, it was not aggressive, it was quiet, and quiet meant certainty. The doctor who had earlier dismissed Ethan stepped forward cautiously, his voice shifting into something more careful. "Sir, we are handling the situation," he said. But the words sounded thinner now, like they had lost their weight the moment they were spoken. Victor did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make the room feel it. Then he asked one question, calm, direct. "How long has he been here?" The doctor hesitated, glancing at a nearby nurse as if the answer might change depending on who spoke it. "Approximately 30 minutes, he replied, and even he seemed unsure if that was the right number anymore. Victor's eyes did not leave his, and in 30 minutes, he continued, his tone unchanged. "You decided he could wait." It was not a question, it was a statement, and it landed with more force than anything louder could have. The doctor opened his mouth to explain, to reference protocols and prioritization, but the words did not come as easily now, because standing in front of him was not someone who accepted explanations built on assumption. Lily watched the exchange unfold, her heart still racing, but now mixed with something else, clarity. She could see it now, the pattern that had been invisible just minutes ago. How quickly the room had judged Ethan, how easily they had placed him at the bottom of a list that did not even need to exist, and how fragile that entire structure became the moment one call was made. Behind Victor, two more men entered quietly, not drawing attention but impossible to ignore, their presence reinforcing what no one needed explained anymore. This was not a situation that would be handled casually. A senior nurse stepped forward, her tone suddenly urgent. "We are preparing him for immediate evaluation," she said, already turning to adjust the chart, her movements faster now, sharper, as if trying to rewrite the last half hour in real time. Victor did not acknowledge the shift. He had already seen what mattered. He finally looked back down at Ethan, and for the first time, his expression softened just slightly, not enough for most to notice, but enough to reveal something deeper than control, respect. "You made them wait," he said quietly, almost to himself, and though Ethan had not spoken a single word since arriving, his eyes moved just enough to meet Victor's, calm, steady, unchanged, as if none of this surprised him, as if this outcome had always been inevitable. And in that silent exchange, Lily understood something the rest of the room was only beginning to realize. Ethan had never been alone, not for a single second. They had only mistaken his silence for absence. And now, standing in the middle of a system that had already judged him wrong, the truth was beginning to unfold, not through shouting, not through force, but through presence alone. And the most unsettling part was not who Victor Romano was. It was the growing question no one had the courage to ask out loud. If this man answered the call without hesitation, without delay, then what kind of person was Ethan Cole, and what did it mean for everyone in this room who had decided he did not matter? No one said it out loud, but everyone in the room felt it at the same time. The rules had just changed, and not because of policy, not because of procedure, but because of presence, the kind of presence that does not ask for permission and does not wait for approval. Victor Romano stood beside Ethan Cole like the outcome had already been decided, and the staff, who minutes ago had moved with casual certainty, now moved with urgency that bordered on panic. Charts were pulled up again, monitors adjusted. A nurse called out for immediate diagnostics that should have been initiated long before. The same doctor who had dismissed Ethan now stood closer than before, his posture corrected, his tone carefully measured. "We are expediting everything now," he said, as if speed could erase the delay, as if action could override assumption. But Victor did not acknowledge the effort, because what mattered had already happened. The decision to wait had already been made, and that decision had revealed more than any chart ever could. Lily Brooks remained just behind the station, watching the shift unfold in real time, her earlier uncertainty replaced by something sharper, awareness. She could see the pattern clearly now. How quickly judgment had formed, how easily it had been accepted, and how suddenly it collapsed under the weight of a single name. She looked at Ethan again, still calm, still composed, as if none of this urgency belonged to him, as if the chaos now surrounding his bed was something external, temporary, almost irrelevant, and that realization unsettled her more than anything else, because it meant he had expected this, every second of it. A senior administrator entered the room, summoned by whispers that had already spread beyond the emergency department, his eyes scanning the scene before settling on Victor, recognition flashing instantly, followed by something more cautious, respect layered with concern. "Sir," he began, stepping forward. "We were not aware of the situation." But the sentence felt incomplete before it even ended, because awareness was no longer the issue. Victor turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting the administrator's without hostility, without raised voice, but with something far more difficult to challenge, certainty. "You were aware enough to decide he could wait," he said, and again, it was not loud, but it carried across the room with absolute clarity. The administrator hesitated, searching for the right response, something that could restore balance. But there was no balance left to restore, not after that statement. Behind them, the two men who had entered with Victor remained still, silent, their presence reinforcing the reality that this was not a misunderstanding to be explained away. It was a moment to be accounted for. Equipment was brought in faster now, nurses moving with precision, calling out updates, adjusting settings, doing everything they should have done from the beginning. But the difference was visible. This was no longer routine care. This was correction, an attempt to realign with something they had failed to recognize. Lily took a step closer again, drawn by the unfolding truth, her voice low as she spoke, almost to herself. "We should have seen it," she said, not expecting anyone to hear, but Victor did, his eyes shifting toward her briefly, not with judgment, but with acknowledgement, as if he understood exactly what she meant, as if he had seen this pattern before in rooms just like this one, rooms where silence was mistaken for insignificance, where calm was mistaken for lack of consequence. Ethan's hand moved slightly against the bed, a small motion, barely noticeable, but it drew Victor's attention immediately. He leaned in just enough to hear him, though no words were spoken, only a breath, controlled, steady, and in that moment, something passed between them again, something unspoken but understood. Victor straightened slowly, turning back toward the staff, his voice measured, final. "You did not ignore a case," he said, his eyes moving from one face to another, ensuring each person felt the weight of what came next. "You ignored a decision that was already made long before he walked in here." Confusion flickered across several faces, the meaning not fully clear yet, but the impact undeniable. The administrator stepped back slightly, the room quieting again, not because the work had stopped, but because everyone was listening now, waiting, trying to understand the scale of what they had just mishandled. And as Lily looked from Victor to Ethan and back again, the question that had been building since the moment she made that call settled firmly in her mind. Not just who was Ethan Cole, but what had he already set in motion before any of them realized he was even there? Because if this was only the beginning, then whatever came next was not going to be controlled by anyone in that room. And for the first time since her shift began, Lily understood that the real situation had nothing to do with medicine at all. It was about power, timing, and the cost of underestimating someone who never needed to prove anything in the first place. The room did not return to normal, not after that sentence. Not after the quiet certainty in Victor Romano's voice made it clear that this was no longer about catching up, but about answering for what had already been done. The staff moved faster, more precise. But there was something else now layered into every action, awareness, not just of Ethan Cole, but of themselves, of how quickly they had judged, how easily they had reduced a man to a line on a screen and a missing insurance field. Lily Brooks stood closer than before, no longer just observing but fully present, her eyes moving between Ethan and the people now rushing to correct their earlier decisions. A nurse adjusted the monitor again, calling out updated readings. A technician confirmed lab requests that should have been ordered on arrival, and the doctor who had once dismissed him now spoke in careful, controlled tones. "We are moving him for immediate evaluation," he said, as if narrating competence could restore it. But even as he spoke, He avoided looking directly at Victor because there was no comfort in that gaze, only reflection. The administrator stepped in again, attempting to regain structure. "We will ensure everything is handled according to the highest standard," he said, his voice measured but strained, and Victor turned slightly, his expression unchanged. "Standards were already set," he replied. "You chose not to meet them." And the words settled heavier than any raised voice ever could. Lily felt the weight of that truth more than anyone, because she had seen both sides of it within the same hour. The dismissal and the correction, the assumption and the consequence. She looked at Ethan again, his breathing steady, his presence still calm despite everything now moving around him. And it struck her fully for the first time. He had never once asked for help. Not a word, not a gesture, not even when they delayed his care. He had simply allowed the room to reveal itself. And now the room was scrambling to rewrite what it had already shown. One of the senior nurses approached Victor cautiously, her voice softer now, respectful in a way it had not been before. "Sir, we are doing everything we can," she said, and Victor met her eyes briefly, not dismissing her, not acknowledging her either, just letting the statement exist without validation, because effort after the fact was not the same as judgment at the start. Behind him, one of the men who had entered with him stepped closer, speaking quietly but clearly enough to be heard. "The board has been notified," he said, and a subtle shift moved through the staff again, because that meant this moment was no longer contained within the walls of the emergency room. It had already moved beyond it, into places where decisions were recorded, reviewed, and remembered. The administrator's posture changed slightly at that, his confidence thinning as the scope of the situation expanded. Lily caught that detail, the realization that this was not just about one patient. It was about a system being seen clearly for what it had done. Ethan's hand moved again, slightly more this time, drawing Victor's attention back immediately. He stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only those nearest could hear. "You gave them time," he said, and though Ethan did not respond verbally, there was a subtle shift in his expression, something almost like acknowledgement, as if that had been the point all along, to give them the chance to act, and to let them decide how they would use it. The doctor returned with updates, his tone now entirely different, focused, professional, careful. "We are ready to proceed," he said, and for the first time since arriving, he looked directly at Ethan, not as a case, not as a delay, but as someone whose presence demanded clarity. Victor stepped back slightly, allowing the staff to move in, but his eyes never left them, not in supervision, but in expectation. And as the team began to prepare Ethan for the next step, Lily stood still, her thoughts aligning into something she could not ignore anymore. This was never about urgency. It was about recognition, and recognition had failed until it was forced. She looked around the room, at the same people who had dismissed him, now working with precision and care, and she understood the difference, not in skill, but in perception, and that difference had changed everything. The administrator cleared his throat, attempting one more time to reclaim control. "We will review what happened here," he said, but Victor did not turn toward him this time. He simply answered, "You will not need to," and the certainty in that statement left no room for negotiation, because whatever review they planned had already begun somewhere else, somewhere they did not control. And as Ethan was finally moved forward with the attention he should have received from the beginning, the room remained quiet in a way it had not been before, not with tension, but with understanding that something irreversible had just taken place, and that the cost of underestimating one silent man had extended far beyond the walls they stood in. Because this was not the end of what had been set in motion, it was only the point where everyone else finally realized it had already begun. By the time the gurney began to move, the entire emergency department had shifted into a different rhythm, not faster, but sharper, every motion deliberate, every instruction precise, as if everyone understood that nothing about this moment could be casual anymore. Ethan Cole was no longer just another patient waiting in line. He had become the center of something much larger, something that extended beyond medicine and into accountability. The wheels rolled smoothly across the polished floor as the team guided him toward the next stage of care, monitors steady, equipment aligned, voices low but focused. And just a few steps behind, Victor Romano walked without urgency, but with presence that filled every inch of space he entered, not watching over Ethan like a guardian, but standing as a reminder of what had already been decided. Lily Brooks followed at a distance, her mind replaying every second from the moment Ethan arrived, every glance that dismissed him, every assumption that pushed him aside, and now every correction that tried to compensate for it. But what stayed with her most was not the shift in behavior. It was the silence from Ethan, the complete absence of resistance. Because now she understood that silence had not been passive, it had been deliberate. The hallway leading to the imaging suite felt longer than usual, quieter than it should have been. Staff stepped aside instinctively, some pretending to stay busy, others watching just long enough to confirm what they were sensing. This was not routine. This was something that would be remembered. The administrator kept pace on the other side, his posture tight, his usual authority replaced with something more cautious, more measured. He checked his phone briefly, reading messages that had already begun to circulate, updates from departments above his level, notifications that confirmed what had been said earlier. This situation had already moved beyond him. One of Victor's associates leaned in slightly, his voice low but firm. "Legal has flagged the intake timeline," he said. "Every timestamp is being reviewed." The administrator heard it, even though it was not meant for him, and the implication landed immediately. This was not just about what happened. It was about when it happened, and how long it took for anyone to care. The doors to the imaging area opened, and the team guided Ethan inside with efficiency that left no room for hesitation. The technician nodded respectfully, already briefed without needing to ask, because word had traveled faster than explanation. Victor stopped just outside the doorway, his gaze steady, allowing the staff to proceed without interference. But his presence remained constant, unshaken. Lily paused beside him, not speaking at first. But then the question that had been building since the beginning finally found its way out, her voice. Quiet, almost careful. "Why did you come so fast?" she asked, and for the first time since entering. Victor turned his head fully toward her, not annoyed, not surprised, just aware. He studied her for a brief moment, as if deciding how much to say, then answered simply, "Because he does not call twice." The words settled into her mind instantly, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just absolute. And in that moment, Lily understood something that had been hidden in plain sight. Ethan had not been waiting for help. He had been allowing time for others to act, and when they did not, he had allowed the next step to happen without hesitation. Inside the room, machines began their work, quiet, precise, finally doing what should have been done from the start. Outside, the hallway remained still, the usual noise of the hospital muted by the awareness that something significant had just unfolded. The administrator stepped closer again, his voice lower now, almost restrained. "We will cooperate fully," he said, but Victor did not respond, because cooperation after exposure was no longer a decision. It was an expectation. Lily looked through the glass panel, watching Ethan as the process moved forward, and for the first time since she met him, she felt something beyond curiosity. She felt respect, not because of who he was connected to, but because of how he had handled everything. The restraint, the patience, the certainty, and as she stood there, the final piece began to settle into place. This was never about being saved. It was about revealing who people were when they thought no one important was watching, revealing how quickly judgment replaced care, and revealing how fragile those judgments became when faced with truth. And as the machines continued their quiet work, and the hallway remained suspended in that heavy silence, one thought stayed with her. This moment was not the end of anything. It was the beginning of something far more difficult to ignore, because once a system is seen clearly, it cannot return to what it was before, and Ethan Cole had just made sure of that without ever raising his voice. The hallway outside the imaging room did not return to its usual pace. Not even after the doors closed and the machines inside began their quiet work. It stayed suspended in that same heavy stillness, like everyone was waiting for something else to happen, something they could not yet see but could already feel. Victor Romano remained exactly where he was, hands relaxed at his sides, posture steady, his presence not loud but impossible to ignore, and beside him, Lily Brooks stood with a new awareness she could not shake. Her earlier curiosity now replaced by a deeper understanding that this moment was only a surface layer of something much bigger. Behind them, The administrator paced slowly, his phone in hand, reading message after message, his expression tightening with each notification. Updates were coming in faster now, not from within the hospital, but from outside, from departments and individuals who had already begun reviewing what happened, timestamps, intake decisions, delays. Everything that had been routine just an hour ago was now being examined like evidence. One of Victor's associates stepped closer again, his tone calm but direct. "They have pulled the intake footage," he said quietly. "Every interaction since he arrived is being reviewed." The administrator stopped walking at that, his breath catching slightly before he recovered, because he understood what that meant. This was no longer internal. This was not something that could be explained away with policy or procedure. This was something that would be seen exactly as it happened, without interpretation, without adjustment. Lily felt that shift too, the realization that nothing from the last hour would remain hidden. Every glance, every delay, every decision would exist exactly as it was. And for the first time, she thought about how different the room had looked from the outside compared to how it felt from within. Inside the imaging room, Ethan Cole lay still as the machines moved around him, controlled, precise. The same system that had ignored him now working with full attention. But even here, even in the center of that care, his presence remained unchanged, calm, measured, as if he had already moved beyond this moment in his mind. As if this part had already been decided long before anyone else realized it was even happening. Victor's eyes remained fixed through the glass panel, not watching with concern, but with recognition, like he had seen this kind of situation unfold before. Not identical, but familiar in its pattern. The delay, the judgment, the correction, and the inevitable consequence that followed. Lily finally spoke again, her voice lower now, more certain. "He knew this would happen, did he not?" she asked, and Victor did not look at her right away. He kept his gaze forward, letting the question settle before answering. "He did not know," he said. He allowed it. And that distinction landed deeper than she expected, because it meant Ethan had not been caught off guard. He had given the room the opportunity to act correctly, and when it did not, he had allowed the next step to unfold without resistance. The administrator stepped closer again, his tone careful, almost restrained. "We are correcting the situation," he said. But this time there was no confidence behind it, only acknowledgement. Victor finally turned toward him, his expression steady. "You are responding to it," he said. Correction would have happened earlier. And again, the words carried more weight than any raised voice could have. The administrator nodded once, unable to argue, because the truth was now visible to everyone, not just in words, but in sequence, in timing, in the undeniable order of events. A nurse exited the imaging room, approaching quickly with updates, her tone professional but edged with urgency. "We are proceeding with full evaluation. Everything is stable," she said, and for a moment, relief flickered across a few faces nearby. But Victor did not react, because stability was not the point. The point had never been about the outcome alone. It was about how the process revealed itself under pressure. Lily watched him carefully, understanding now that his silence carried more meaning than anything else being said around her, because he was not here to demand results. He was here to witness what had already been shown. And that difference changed everything. The hallway remained quiet, not empty, but focused, every movement now intentional, every word measured, because everyone understood that nothing in this moment would be forgotten. And as the imaging process continued behind the glass, and the quiet weight of consequence settled deeper into the walls around them, Lily realized something that made her chest tighten slightly. This was not just about Ethan Cole. This was about every moment before him. Every person who had been dismissed the same way, but never had a number to call, never had someone arrive, never had a system forced to look at itself this clearly. And that realization did not bring comfort. It brought clarity, because it meant this moment was not rare, it was just visible. And as she stood there, watching the reflection of the room in the glass, she understood that whatever happened next would not undo what had already been revealed. It would only confirm it. Time did not move the same way anymore in that hallway. It stretched, slowed, bent around the quiet gravity of what had already been set into motion, and no one dared to interrupt it. Not with unnecessary words, not with empty reassurances, because everything that needed to be said had already been exposed in the silence between decisions. Lily Brooks remained by the glass, her reflection faint against the sterile surface, her eyes fixed on Ethan Cole as the imaging process continued, machines moving with precision that now felt almost apologetic, as if the system itself was trying to correct something deeper than a delay, something structural, something invisible until it was forced into the light. Victor Romano had not moved far, still positioned where he could see everything without. Stepping in, not interfering, not directing, simply present, and that presence continued to shape the room in ways no one could ignore. Behind them, the administrator stopped pacing altogether, his phone now held still in his hand, not because the messages had stopped, but because reading them no longer changed anything. The reality was already clear. Every second that passed now was being recorded, not just by systems, but by memory, by the people standing there realizing they had been part of something they did not fully understand until it was too late to hide it. One of the associates spoke again, his tone unchanged, steady. "External review has started," he said. "They are not waiting for internal reports." And that sentence settled into the room like a final confirmation. Control had shifted completely. Whatever narrative the hospital might have tried to build was no longer theirs to shape. Lily felt a subtle tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. This was accountability in real time, not delayed, not filtered, and certainly not optional. She looked back at Ethan, his face calm, unchanged, and something about that calm began to carry a different meaning now. Not just patience, not just control, but history. As if this was not the first time he had allowed a situation to reveal itself this way. And that thought stayed with her, growing heavier with each passing moment. Because it meant this was not accidental. This was pattern. Victor finally shifted his stance slightly, not out of discomfort, but as if aligning with something only he could see. Lily noticed it immediately. The subtle change, the almost imperceptible shift in attention, and she followed his gaze back through the glass, where Ethan's eyes, though still, carried a depth that had not been fully understood before. She spoke again, more certain this time. "He has done this before." And Victor did not deny it, did not confirm it directly either. He simply answered in a way that left no room for doubt. "He has seen enough to know when to let people decide for themselves." And that answer settled deeper than anything else, because it removed any illusion of randomness. This was not a situation that had spiraled out of control. It was one that had been allowed to unfold exactly as it did. The difference was not in the outcome, but in the exposure. Inside the room, a technician adjusted the settings and nodded to a colleague, their movements now synchronized, efficient, everything finally aligned with the level of care that should have been present from the beginning. But even as they worked, there was an awareness in their eyes, a quiet understanding that they were not just performing a task, they were participating in the correction of something that should not have needed correction at all. The administrator stepped forward again, his voice lower than before, almost careful. "We are implementing immediate changes," he said, but this time the statement sounded less like assurance and more like admission. Victor turned his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Changes are not the point," he replied. "Clarity is." And the distinction cut through the hallway with quiet precision, because it meant this moment was not about fixing what happened. It was about seeing it clearly enough that it could not happen the same way again. Lily felt that truth settle into her fully, not as a concept, but as something real, something that would stay with her long after this shift ended. She looked around the hallway, at the same faces that had once moved with routine confidence, now standing in a space defined by reflection, and she understood that no policy, update, no meeting, no statement would carry the same weight as what they had just witnessed, because this was not theoretical, it was lived, it was seen, it was undeniable. Inside the imaging room, the process reached its final stage, the machines slowing, the team preparing to transition Ethan to the next step. And as that moment approached, the quiet tension in the hallway shifted again, not into relief, but into anticipation, because everyone understood now that the most important part of this situation was not what had already happened, but what would follow, what would be said, what would be decided, and how far the consequences would reach. Lily remained still, her focus unwavering, because she knew that whatever came next would not just define Ethan Cole, It would define everyone who had been part of the moment they chose to overlook him. And as the doors began to open again, and the movement resumed, one thought stayed clear in her mind. Nothing about this was over. This was only the point where the truth became impossible to ignore. The doors slid open with a soft mechanical sound. But the moment carried far more weight than the noise itself. Every set of eyes in the hallway shifted at once as Ethan Cole was guided back out. Not rushed, not overlooked, but centered, finally treated with the precision that had been delayed. The team moved in sync, voices calm, controlled. But underneath that control was something new, awareness that this was no longer just a procedure. This was a moment being watched, measured, and remembered. Victor Romano stepped forward just enough to meet the movement, his presence aligning with Ethan's position without disrupting it, never taking over, never interfering, but never stepping away either. Lily Brooks felt her breath steady as she watched the transition, her earlier uncertainty replaced now with a focused clarity. She could see the difference in every motion, the careful way the staff handled Ethan, the attention to detail that had not existed before, and the unspoken understanding that none of this could be undone, only acknowledged. The doctor leading the team spoke with a different tone now, his words deliberate, respectful. "We are moving him to a monitored room for continued evaluation," he said, and this time he looked directly at Ethan as he spoke, not past him, not through him, but at him, as if recognition had finally caught up with reality. Ethan's eyes opened slightly more than before, just enough to register the shift around him, not surprised. Not impressed, just aware. And in that awareness there was something that unsettled Lily again. Not fear, not relief, but confirmation, as if this outcome had always been expected. The administrator followed closely, his posture controlled but no longer authoritative, his role reduced to observation rather than direction. His phone buzzed again, and this time he did not ignore it. He read the message, his expression tightening for a brief second before he masked it. But the change was visible, and Lily noticed. She saw the moment something external reached him, something that confirmed this situation had extended beyond internal handling entirely. One of Victor's associates leaned in again, his voice low but clear. "They have escalated to full review," he said. "Executive level." And that single phrase carried more consequence than anything said before, because it meant decisions were no longer being made here. They were being made above, by people who would see this not as an isolated incident, but as a pattern. Victor did not respond verbally, but his stillness deepened, as if acknowledging something already understood. Lily walked a few steps closer, keeping pace with the movement, her eyes fixed on Ethan, and for the first time, she spoke to him directly, her voice steady, respectful. "They are taking care of you now," she said, and though Ethan did not respond in words, his gaze shifted toward her briefly. Just enough to acknowledge the statement, just enough to confirm that he had heard, but also to remind her that this was never about whether they would take care of him. It was about when they chose to, and why. That distinction settled heavily in her mind. The team reached the doorway to the next unit, the transition smooth, controlled, every step now aligned with proper care. But the hallway behind them did not return to normal. It remained charged, filled with the quiet understanding that something irreversible had occurred. The administrator slowed his pace slightly, falling just behind Victor, his voice lower now, almost careful. "We will address this thoroughly," he said, but Victor did not turn, did not acknowledge the statement, because addressing something after it had been exposed was not the same as understanding it when it mattered. Lily caught that silence, the refusal to engage with reassurance, and she understood why. Because reassurance did not change what had already been shown. Inside the monitored room, the team prepared Ethan for the next phase, equipment aligned, voices precise, everything now operating at the level it should have from the beginning. But even here, even with everything corrected, the weight of the earlier decision remained, not visible, but present, like a shadow that could not be removed. Victor finally stepped closer to the bedside, his voice low, controlled, meant only for Ethan. "You gave them the chance," he said, and Ethan's eyes held steady on him, calm, unwavering, and though no words followed, the meaning was clear. The chance had been given, and it had been used to reveal, not to correct. Lily stood at the edge of the room, watching the exchange, and something inside her settled into place completely. This was never about urgency, never about resources, never about ability. It was about perception, and perception had failed until it was forced to change. She looked around at the staff now working with full attention, and she understood the difference more clearly than ever, not in what they could do, but in when they chose to do it, and as. The room stabilized, and the immediate movement slowed into controlled care. The larger realization remained. This moment was not defined by what happened after the call. It was defined by everything that happened before it. And now that it had been seen, it could not be unseen, not by her, not by anyone who stood in that hallway, and certainly not by those who were already reviewing every second of it from a distance. The room settled into a controlled rhythm, but the weight of everything that had happened did not fade with it. It lingered in every glance, every movement, every word that was now chosen more carefully than before. Ethan Cole lay centered in the monitored room, surrounded by equipment that now worked with quiet precision, each reading steady, each adjustment deliberate. The same system that had overlooked him now operating at its highest standard, but the difference was no longer in capability. It was in awareness. Victor Romano stood near the foot of the bed, not speaking, not directing, simply present, and that presence continued to define the space without needing to assert itself. Lily Brooks remained just inside the doorway, her posture still, her mind no longer racing but focused, as if everything she had seen had aligned into something she could not ignore. The doctor approached again, his tone consistent, professional, but layered now with something else, accountability. "All results are stable," he said, looking directly at Ethan before shifting his gaze briefly toward Victor, not seeking approval, but acknowledging reality. And for a moment, the room felt balanced, not because everything had been corrected, but because everything had finally been recognized. The administrator stood just outside, speaking quietly into his phone, his words measured, careful, as if each sentence carried weight beyond the conversation itself. "Yes, it is being handled," he said, pausing, listening, then adding, "No, it was not escalated in time." And that admission, though spoken softly, echoed louder than any earlier justification. Lily heard it clearly, and it confirmed what she already understood. This was no longer about whether something went wrong. It was about how long it was allowed to stay wrong before anyone chose to act. Victor's gaze shifted slightly, not toward the administrator, but toward Ethan again, and in that movement there was something steady, something grounded in certainty rather than reaction. He stepped closer, just enough for his voice to reach without carrying beyond the bed. "They are moving now," he said, calm, controlled, and Ethan's eyes met his. Not with gratitude, not with relief, but with quiet acknowledgement, as if the movement had never been the question, only the timing of it. Lily felt that distinction settle deeper into her understanding, because it reframed everything she had witnessed. This was not about rescue. It was about revelation. The system had not failed suddenly. It had revealed its pattern under pressure, and now that pattern could not be denied. One of the nurses adjusted the monitor, her hands steady, her focus sharp, every action now aligned with purpose, but there was a visible awareness in her expression, the kind that comes from realizing something larger than the immediate task. She glanced briefly at Lily, and in that moment, no words were needed. They both understood that what had happened would not be forgotten when the shift ended. The administrator stepped back into the room, his voice low, controlled. "We will ensure this does not happen again," he said. But even as he spoke, the statement felt incomplete, because prevention after exposure carried a different weight than awareness before action. Victor turned his head slightly, meeting the administrator's gaze for a brief moment. "It already did," he replied, and the simplicity of that sentence removed any illusion of resolution, because it placed the focus not on the future, but on the undeniable reality of what had already occurred. The room fell into a quieter stillness, not tense, not chaotic, but reflective, as if everyone present was recalibrating their understanding of what their roles had meant in the moments before the call. Lily stepped a little closer, her voice steady, no longer uncertain. "He never asked for anything," she said, not to anyone in particular, but the statement carried across the room. And it was true. Ethan had not requested urgency, had not demanded attention, had not even questioned the delay. He had simply allowed the system to act according to its own judgment, and that judgment had revealed everything. Victor did not respond immediately, but after a moment, he spoke, his tone unchanged. He did not need to. And those 5 words settled into the room with finality. Because they explained everything without needing further detail, Ethan's presence had never been about proving worth. It had been about allowing others to show how they measured it. And as the machines continued their steady work, and the staff maintained their precise movements, the larger truth remained. This moment was not defined by the care being given now. It was defined by the care that had been withheld before, and no amount of correction could erase that, only acknowledge it. And as Lily stood there, fully aware of the shift that had taken place, she understood that this was the part people often missed, not the arrival, not the reaction, but the quiet exposure of what happens when someone is judged before they are known, and how quickly that judgment collapses when the truth finally steps into the room. The room did not feel the same anymore, not because of what had been fixed, but because of what could no longer be ignored. Every person inside it now carried the awareness of a moment that had already defined them. Ethan Cole remained still at the center of it all, not as a victim, not as someone rescued, but as the one who had allowed the entire system to reveal itself without interference. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. The staff moved with practiced precision, but there was a quiet restraint in every action now, as if each person understood they were no longer just doing their job. They were being seen in it. Victor Romano stood with the same calm presence, not imposing, not reacting, simply existing in a way that made every other movement in the room more deliberate. Lily Brooks took another step forward, no longer hesitant, no longer uncertain. Her voice steady as she finally spoke the thought that had been building since the beginning. He never needed anyone to come for him, did he? And this time Victor looked directly at her, not dismissing the question, not avoiding it, but answering in a way that reframed everything she had witnessed. He needed them to show who they were first, he said, and the clarity of that statement settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place, because it meant this had never been about dependency. It had been about exposure, about giving the system the chance to act without pressure, without influence, and seeing exactly what it chose to do. The administrator stood near the edge of the room, his posture rigid, his voice quieter than it had been at any point before. "We will take responsibility for what happened," he said, but the words sounded different now. Not like a solution, not like a correction, but like an acknowledgement of something that could not be undone. Victor did not respond immediately. He let the silence stretch just enough for the weight of that statement to settle fully. Then he spoke, his tone unchanged. "Responsibility is not taken after the fact," he said. "It is shown in the moment it matters." And no one in the room could argue with that, because they had all seen the moment, they had all been part of it, and they had all made their choices within it. Lily felt a quiet shift inside her, not discomfort, not fear, but understanding, a deeper awareness of what her role meant beyond tasks and procedures. She looked at Ethan again, his eyes open now, steady, aware, and for the first time, she met his gaze without hesitation, not as someone trying to help, but as someone who understood, even if only partially, what had just unfolded. And in that brief exchange, there was something unspoken but clear. This was not about blame. It was about recognition, about seeing clearly what had been invisible before. One of the nurses stepped back from the equipment, her work complete for the moment, her hand still but her expression thoughtful, as if she too was processing what this meant beyond the room. The administrator glanced at his phone again, another message arriving, his jaw tightening slightly as he read it. Then he looked up, his voice lower now, almost controlled. "They want a full report by morning," he said, and the sentence carried a different kind of finality, because it meant this moment would not fade into routine. It would be documented, reviewed, remembered. Victor's gaze shifted briefly toward him, not with surprise, not with concern, but with something closer to expectation, as if that outcome had been inevitable from the start. Lily took a slow breath, her mind settling into the reality of what she had witnessed, not just a shift in treatment, but a complete exposure of how quickly judgment could replace care, and how fragile that judgment became when confronted with truth. She spoke again, quietly, but with certainty. "This will change things," and Victor did not deny it. But his response carried a different kind of weight. "It will show things," he said, and that distinction mattered, because change could be promised. But truth could only be revealed. Ethan's hand moved slightly again, not out of discomfort, but with intention, a small, controlled motion that drew Victor's attention immediately. He stepped closer, his voice low, meant only for Ethan. "It is done," he said, and though no words followed, Ethan's eyes held steady on him, calm, unwavering. And in that stillness, the meaning was clear. The moment had passed. The system had been seen, and whatever came next would no longer be hidden behind assumption. Lily stood at the edge of that realization, fully aware now that what she had witnessed would stay with her, not as a story, not as an exception, but as a standard against which everything else would be measured. And as the room settled into its quiet rhythm once more, one truth remained undeniable. The most powerful moment had not been when help arrived. It had been when no help was given, and everything that followed had simply confirmed what that moment revealed. Nothing in the room needed to be rushed anymore. And that was the part that felt the most different, not the speed of the care, not the precision of the staff, but the absence of assumption, the quiet understanding that every action now carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Ethan Cole remained steady at the center of it all, his presence unchanged, not elevated by attention, not defined by what had just happened, but consistent, as if this outcome had always been part of a larger sequence that did not depend on anyone in the room recognizing it in time. Victor Romano stood a step back now, no longer needing to anchor the space because the truth had already done that on its own. The monitors continued their steady rhythm, each sound controlled, each reading stable, but the silence between those sounds carried more meaning than the data itself. Lily Brooks remained near the bedside, her posture grounded, her earlier questions replaced by something deeper, not curiosity anymore, but clarity. She looked at Ethan, then at the staff, then back again, and for the first time since the beginning of her shift, she understood exactly what she had witnessed, not a crisis, not a rescue, but a reveal, a moment where the system had shown itself without interference, and now had to exist with that truth fully visible. The administrator stepped closer once more, his voice measured, stripped of the confidence it once carried. "We will cooperate with everything moving forward," he said, and even as the words left his mouth, they sounded less like a promise and more like an acceptance of something already decided. Victor did not respond immediately, his gaze resting briefly on Ethan before shifting toward the administrator. "You already are," he said, calm, certain, and that response carried a different kind of finality, because it made clear that cooperation was no longer optional. It was already in progress, already required. Lily felt that distinction settle into her fully, because it confirmed what she had been sensing. This moment was no longer contained within the hospital. It had moved beyond it, into places where explanations would not soften the truth, where timelines would matter more than intentions, and where the sequence of decisions would speak louder than any statement. One of the nurses adjusted the settings again, her movement steady, practiced, but her expression thoughtful, as if she too was carrying the weight of what had been revealed. She glanced at Lily for a brief second, and in that glance there was something shared, an understanding that this was not something that would fade with time. This would remain, shaping how they saw every patient who walked through those doors after tonight. Ethan's eyes shifted slightly again, not searching, not questioning, simply acknowledging the room as it now existed, and in that small movement, there was a quiet authority, not imposed, not declared, but present. Victor stepped forward one final time, his voice low, controlled, meant only for Ethan. "They saw it," he said, and Ethan's gaze held steady, the meaning clear without words. The system had revealed itself, and that was all that needed to happen. Lily watched that exchange closely, understanding now that the most important part of this entire moment was not what had been corrected, but what had been seen, because correction could be temporary, but clarity remained. The administrator exhaled slowly, his posture shifting slightly, no longer trying to manage the moment, but standing within it, as part of it. "This will be reviewed at every level," he said, and this time, the statement carried no attempt at control, only acknowledgement. Victor nodded once, not in approval, but in recognition, because that outcome had already been set in motion the moment the first decision was made to let Ethan wait. The room remained quiet, not tense, not chaotic, but settled in a way that felt different from anything before, as if the space itself had adjusted to a new understanding. Lily took a small step closer to the bed, her voice steady, clear. "I am sorry," she said, not as an apology for one moment, but as an acknowledgement of everything that led to it. Ethan's eyes met hers briefly, calm, unwavering, and though he did not respond, the silence did not feel empty. It felt complete, because this was never about receiving apologies. It was about allowing the truth to exist without distortion. Victor turned slightly, preparing to step away, his role in this moment no longer active because the purpose had already been fulfilled. He paused for a fraction of a second, his voice carrying just enough for the room to hear. "Remember this moment," he said, not as a command, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact, because it was a moment that would not disappear, not in memory, not in record, and not in consequence. And as he moved toward the door, the room remained still, not because it lacked motion, but because it was holding on to something far more important than action. The understanding that what had happened here could not be undone, only carried forward, and as Lily stood there, fully aware of what she had witnessed, she understood that this was the part that mattered most, not the arrival, not the correction, but the moment where everything became visible, and once seen, could never return to being ignored. The room did not return to what it had been before. Even as the immediate urgency settled into routine care, something had shifted too deeply to be reversed, not in the machines, not in the procedures, but in the people who stood within it. Ethan Cole remained calm, steady, his presence no longer questioned, no longer overlooked, but fully recognized for what it had revealed rather than what it demanded. The monitors continued their quiet rhythm, each sound precise, controlled. But now every person who heard them understood that those sounds had not changed. Only the attention given to them had. Lily Brooks stood beside the bed, her posture grounded in a way it had not been at the beginning of her shift, her eyes no longer searching for answers, but holding on to the clarity she had gained. She looked at Ethan, then at the room, and finally allowed herself to speak one last time, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding. "We saw you too late," she said, her voice steady, not seeking forgiveness, not offering explanation, just stating the truth as it had unfolded. Ethan's eyes met hers again, calm, unwavering, and though he did not speak, the silence carried a meaning that did not require words, because this was never about being seen at the right time. It was about allowing the moment to show who chose not to see at all. Victor Romano paused near the doorway, his presence still anchoring the space even as he prepared to leave. He turned his head, slightly, his voice low but clear enough to reach every corner of the room. "He was never hard to see," he said, and the simplicity of that statement cut deeper than anything else that had been said, because it removed every excuse, every justification, every attempt to explain what had happened. The administrator stood still, no longer attempting to manage the situation, no longer offering reassurances. His role now reduced to acknowledgement, his voice quiet, almost reflective. "We will carry this forward," he said, and this time the words held a different weight, not as a promise of change, but as an acceptance of responsibility that could not be avoided. Lily felt that shift clearly, because she understood now that what had happened was not an isolated mistake. It was a reflection of something deeper, something that had been invisible until it was forced into view. One of the nurses adjusted the final settings, her hands steady, her focus complete, but her expression thoughtful, as if she too understood that her role had expanded beyond the immediate task, that every decision moving forward would now be measured against what had been revealed here. Ethan's hand moved slightly once. More, not out of need, but with quiet intention, and that small movement drew Victor's attention again. He stepped just close enough to speak without raising his voice. "It is clear now," he said, and Ethan's gaze held steady, confirming what did not need to be spoken. Clarity had been achieved, not through force, not through demand, but through patience and timing, the kind that allowed truth to surface without interference. Lily took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something she would carry with her long after this shift ended. She understood now that this was not a story about arrival, not a story about correction, but a story about exposure, about what happens when someone is judged before they are known, and how quickly that judgment collapses when the truth stands in front of it. Victor turned fully toward the exit, his role complete, not because he had changed anything, but because he had witnessed everything that needed to be seen. He paused for a final moment, his voice calm, certain, leaving the room with something that would remain long after he was gone. "Do not wait next time," he said, and the words carried no anger, no accusation, only a quiet expectation that could not be ignored. The door opened, then closed behind him, and the room remained still for a brief moment, not empty, not silent, but filled with understanding, the kind that does not fade, the kind that reshapes how everything is seen moving forward. Lily looked at Ethan one last time, her voice no longer uncertain, no longer questioning, but grounded in the clarity she had gained. "We will not forget this," she said, and for the first time since he arrived, Ethan's expression shifted ever so slightly, not into a smile, not into relief, but into something deeper, acknowledgement, and in that small, controlled change, the final truth settled into place. This was never about making a scene, never about proving power. It was about becoming the moment that could not be ignored, the moment that forced everything else to be seen clearly. And as the monitors continued their steady rhythm, and the room moved forward with a new awareness, one thing remained certain. The silence that had once been mistaken for absence had become the loudest truth of all.